Good evening. Today, we will be speaking specifically about the new chronology. Let us begin with the question that you have printed out. I should say that Garry Kasparov brought several questions. We selected two of them that he will ask you. The first question, please.
It seems to me a fairly obvious question, given that everyone is interested in why a world chess champion is sitting here. It seems reasonable to ask the television audience whether a debate on issues of chronology should be conducted only by credentialed historians.
In fact, there are already people participating. I thank everyone who is taking part in our debate via the internet. There is quite a large audience of people who watch our program specifically about the new chronology. Your opinion is extremely important to us. So please call and tell us what you think. Now I would like to remind you that there were several broadcasts with Andrei Maksimov when we talked about the theory of Fomenko and Nasovsky. Then there was a broadcast with historian Afanasyev. Quite a few people and newspapers accused me of behaving improperly. I apologize if that was the case. I apologize to Yuri Nikolaevich if I behaved incorrectly. I can explain this only by the fact that I personally strongly dislike it when historical science is analyzed through ideology and ideological labels are attached to it. In your opinion, why is Fomenko's theory so often considered precisely from an ideological point of view?
First of all, probably because it is very difficult to object to it and to argue against it in any substantive way. Fomenko's theory can be divided into two parts. The first part is negative in nature. It is the destruction of established myths and stereotypes. It seems to me that an absolutely colossal amount of work has been done here. But most likely it should be evaluated not by historians, but primarily by mathematicians and physicists, because it uses data from fundamental science that allegedly show that many so-called proofs of the existence of the ancient world are, in general, ephemeral. The second part is positive. It is an attempt to construct a different edifice of history and to present the course of events in a different way. Incidentally, this is precisely where Fomenko is attacked. In reality, this is much easier, because after so many centuries, when there have been so many falsifications and distortions, reconstructing the exact course of events is very difficult. And here it is very convenient to attack, because psychologically a person is accustomed to certain stereotypes. Historical stereotypes are instilled in us from childhood. We all know that there was Hellas, that there was King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. Everyone has seen this in films. We cannot even imagine how much of this information lives inside us. It is impossible to abandon it. That is, everyone learned where the Kulikovo field is located, we all know this. If someone says that in fact it was in Moscow, and that the battle was not between Russians and Tatars, but was actually an internal horde conflict, this immediately provokes a reaction. It must be said that all the criticism of Fomenko's new theory that I have read, and I have read quite a lot of critical articles, relies precisely on the use of stereotypes of human psychology. I have not yet encountered any serious arguments. What depresses me most is when political arguments are used. It seems to me that this already goes beyond the pale, because it has the flavor of a kind of inquisition.
In response to this question, I am very interested in asking you about this specifically. The accusations were as follows. This theory, which claims that there existed a huge Russia horde empire, could be used by the blend of communist and Nazi ideology. That exact wording was even used. It would be very interesting to know what you think about this.
It seems to me that my political views are very well known to everyone. Despite the wishes of Fomenko's opponents, it is very difficult to classify me as belonging to that part of the political spectrum. I proceeded from the assumption that Fomenko's theory explains, to a much greater extent, the absurdities and riddles that are irresolvable within the framework of modern chronology. It seems to me that it is more important to ask oneself a different question. The first question should be quite simple. Does there exist real confirmation of the entirety of modern chronology? Honest historians admit in private conversations that there are many problems. One can try to resolve them. One can add something here, subtract something there. But in reality, the situation with evidence is poor. First, and it seems to me, most importantly, there are no originals. They simply do not exist. After all, everything we know about the so-called ancient world dates at best from the 15th century, and more likely from the 16th-17th centuries. More precisely, we are actually reading everything that was written over the last 150 years. 99.9% of all historical literature that inspires reverence in an ordinary person was written in the last century, and at its foundation lie literally just a few books, or, more precisely, not the books themselves, but their interpretation. That is, historical science itself cannot offer anything. Therefore, there is no need for evasion when some historians say, "You know, only a historian can conduct this debate. If you don't understand it, you shouldn't take part." When a serious discussion begins, what do they immediately bring up? Radiocarbon dating, astronomy. And what does that have to do with history? So, it turns into a vicious circle. If Fomenko puts forward arguments, they tell him, "You are not a historian." And when it comes to a historical debate, say, with an informed layperson like me, they say, "Come on. There is radiocarbon dating. Everything has been proven." In America, I have repeatedly asked people with enormous knowledge, professional physicists, moreover those specializing in radiocarbon dating. I assert that not a single physicist who values his reputation would claim that radiocarbon dating gives an accurate assessment over a 5,000-year span of human history. Not a single one who values his reputation. If anyone in Russia has doubts, I am ready to arrange debates for them with a professional American physicist, who will simply laugh at his colleague.
Let's listen to a phone call, please.
Good evening. Just a little in continuation of what you were just talking about. You have very strong arguments against Fomenko's opponents. What you are saying all sounds very appealing. Do you have any concrete arguments in favor of Fomenko's theory? That is, any of your own specific calculations, conjectures, and so on? Thank you.
Show the book.
We can show the book.
A new book by Fomenko and Nasovsky has come out. Or has it not yet been released? Is this a proof copy?
This is a proof copy.
It has a foreword by Garry Kasparov. It contains fairly detailed arguments in favor of the theory, but briefly.
In fact, I had done independent work even before I met Anatoly Fomenko. For almost a year I was checking things on my own, looking for arguments. First of all, I was very strongly struck by the fact that on all my travels I could not find a single concrete construction date for any church in Western Europe. A church was built, but there is no date. Later, in the 19th century, someone puts up a plaque, but there were no dates originally. That, in my view, strongly contradicts human psychology. Such a structure is erected, Notre Dame de Paris for example. Why is it not stated which king built it and when? Why is this date not authentic to the moment of the cathedral's construction? In addition, I tried to look at a wide range of sources and came to the conclusion that one has to search somewhere around the 18th century. I came across an astonishing book, the first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, from 1768. Completely incredible things turn up there. The point is that this book is a compilation of all human knowledge of that time, the mid-18th century. It turns out that many events are presented in a completely different way. In fact, it's not even about events so much. It's a kind of catalog of sciences, mathematics, geometry, geography, astronomy, medicine, anatomy, accounting, horse riding. Everything that was known at the time was gathered there. But things don't add up. For example, Fomenko claims that the city of Novgorod did not exist at the location where it is today, that it was on the Volga, apparently what is now Yaroslavl. I look at the map, a brilliant world map made by the English. Thank God, sailors knew how to draw maps. What they didn't know, they honestly admitted they didn't know. About California they wrote that it was either an island or a peninsula. We don't know, we haven't been there. Alaska isn't drawn at all. Africa is drawn brilliantly. Latin America is drawn brilliantly. Russia, all the cities are precisely marked. Moscow, Petersburg, Vladimir, Ryazan, Vologda, Kostroma, Tobolsk, Tiflis, Pskov. Everything is perfect, everything is in place, but Novgorod is not there. Or rather, it is there. It is absent, but in fact it appears between Belgorod and Poltava. The map is excellent, everything is there, but Novgorod is not where it should be. According to traditional history, this is one of the cities the English were absolutely supposed to know. And yet it's not on the map. Or rather, the only mistake is that it's in a completely different place. One can give quite a few such examples. For instance, it was very interesting for me to reread certain books. I read them in the original, because I believe it's important to read the original so that no one can say the translation is wrong. I mean Edward Gibbon's book, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. When you read Gibbon's description of the invasions of the eastern tribes, you realize that he himself was confused. Because he felt that the events were apparently the same, but the time scale he was forced to work with, and he was writing in the late 18th century, was much larger. It is completely obvious that the descriptions of the campaigns of Attila and Batu Khan are identical. You understand that roughly the same thing is being described. Moreover, Gibbon says some downright shocking things. For example, he claims that Attila's kingdom was located on the banks of the Volga, and that Attila's uncle was named either Ruz or Rugilas.
I don't think you're the only person in the world who has read this book. Do historians really not read this at all, and don't analyze books like this in any way?
In reality, most historians prefer not to notice such things, because a certain historical myth has already been created, within which research takes place. I've noticed that most books from the 17th and 18th centuries have simply been taken out of circulation. I think that roughly 80% of the books Gibbon used in his truly phenomenal work have simply been pushed aside. Because if one starts analyzing the parallel theories that existed, today's official edifice will collapse immediately. There are too many questions that cannot be answered. The easiest thing is to declare those books mythical, full of crude errors, or better yet, to forget them altogether, because after all, they were used by Gibbon, and that's somehow inappropriate.
I see. So, we have a debate going on between those who believe that disputes should be conducted only by credentialed historians, 24 think so, and those who think otherwise, 21. So, overall, the score is even. Let's see what happens next. We have a call.
Harry Kimovich, first of all, good evening.
Good evening.
Second, you may remember that back in 1994, I gave you a computer program. My name is O. Rahov.
Yes, I remember.
You remember? It's kind of amazing how unexpectedly we've run into each other again.
What's your question?
My question concerns content analysis. Fomenko presents many different kinds of evidence in support of the validity of his constructions. In these arguments, the following approach is used. Certain combinations of letters are interpreted one way or another. You understand what I'm referring to?
I do.
On the basis of such interpretations, he then builds generalizations. From a mathematical point of view, this is not entirely correct. At the same time, he himself speaks very politely and carefully. He says that these are hypotheses which, generally speaking, require verification. I'm interested in your opinion on this. That's the first point. And the second, are there people willing to carry out a content analysis? I can provide the necessary software for that. So, we're talking specifically about letter combinations that could shed light on certain issues.
The question may not be clear to everyone, so you should first explain the question and then answer it. What is content analysis, and how should it be carried out?
Apparently, this refers to the linguistic analysis that Fomenko performs on various texts, sometimes rearranging consonants, assuming that texts might have been read right to left or left to right. Fomenko openly admits that these are hypotheses. In fact, there's no need to argue here, they really are hypotheses. One simply has to acknowledge that what exists today is also a hypothesis that needs to be tested. Fomenko has pointed out, and every historian knows this, that at the time when all these names emerged, there were no vowel letters. Writing was done without vocalization, and then quite astonishing things appear. For example, without vowels, in Latin notation, Corinth and Carthage would be the same city. Anything is possible. If someone calls for conducting such analyses, I'm in favor. It seems to me that this is exactly what should have been done long ago, without attaching political labels. One must analyze his astronomical theories, analyze what is written about physics, about radiocarbon dating, of course, analyze the linguistics. In fact, there are many areas that require very detailed analysis. Because the volume of information that has been pushed aside over the last 200 years is simply staggering.
Can you explain why this happened? Why do historians study history the way they do, and not differently?
I believe that from the very moment of its birth, history has been used as a political weapon. This is completely obvious, and today we simply underestimate the impact this weapon has on the population. We saw how this was done in the 20th century. Take Stalin, for example. 20 years later he rewrote the entire history, though it didn't really work. Still, 2 generations of Soviet people studied history using History of the All-Union Communist Party, short course. Now imagine a situation 400 years ago in some country, say France, where there is a single printing press. A civil war has ended, and the Bourbon dynasty has come to power, some backwoods family that happened to win the Civil War. What do you think Henry IV of Bourbon has to do? He has to prove his lineage, the unquestionable legitimacy of this dynasty. And that's exactly what he does. 9 generations back, 250 years earlier, he finds kinship with the founder of the Valois dynasty. From that point on, he is obliged to start rewriting history in order to elevate the importance of his family and, if possible, eliminate political opponents. This is the end of the 16th century, perhaps even a little later if one applies some correction. I believe the chronology itself is not entirely accurate, but for some reason, while acknowledging that throughout the entire 20th century, history, or rather pseudo-history, was used as a political weapon, we nonetheless take on faith everything that was written in the 16th and 17th centuries, when the need for this was far greater and the possibilities for falsification were practically unlimited.
This question may not be for Garry Kimovich but rather for the the Fomenko group. However, if Garry Kasparov can answer, it would be interesting to hear his opinion. When examining the history and chronology of Armenia, the Fomenko group, for some reason, focused not on royal dynasties but on the line of Catholicoses. In my view, this is a very strange approach. Thank you.
I'm not aware of that.
I do know that the dynasty of Catholicoses was chosen. They were trying to identify potential overlaps between different royal dynasties, or comparisons were also made with the Roman popes. In my view, there's no need to focus on these particulars. It seems to me that for those who want to understand whether this theory is plausible, it is far more important to try to answer the main question. Are there any genuine confirmations of the existence of the ancient world at all? Let's set aside what we were taught from childhood and try to look at the entire body of factual material. What actually exists? For example, we are told about the Library of Alexandria, but regrettably, it burned down. Can a burned library be considered an argument in favor of the existence of an ancient repository of books? The answer is no, and this situation is ubiquitous. For instance, when visiting Cyprus, I naturally went to the monastery of the Virgin of Caicos and familiarized myself with its history. A very interesting history, vividly described, dating back to the late 11th century. But unfortunately, fires destroy everything. There were 3 major fires. The most detailed and precise history was written by Ephraim the Athenian in 1751. Although it should be said that earlier histories existed that contradicted him. Still, he wrote the most accurate account. But alas, all the sources he relied on, burned in a fire in 1655. So, what do we have? We have no sources. We have an 18th century work that refers to something. And there are no other confirmations. A careful examination shows that everything we are familiar with is in exactly the same condition. For example, who can immediately say how many years separated the most famous Greek military commander, Alexander the Great, from the historiography of Arrian, the book that many historians cite? 4 centuries. 4 centuries later, Arrian wrote a detailed account of Alexander the Great, referring to sources which, alas, have all disappeared. Naturally, Arrian's original text has not survived. And only in the 16th century did this book reappear. But of course, we cannot question it, a supporter of traditional chronology will say.
One gets the impression that some kind of dark force was simply destroying everything, or that after writing their own account, they removed all the others so that no suspicions would arise.
This is psychology. I conducted an experiment. I discussed 2 possibilities with intelligent, well-educated people who know history. I say, you know, there is a theory that the pyramids are much older. Indeed, Champollion himself gave a date 2,300 years earlier than today's official chronology. Just pulled out of thin air, 5300 BC. Today they say something like 2800. But notice the discrepancy. The very first person to decipher hieroglyphs gives such a date. I say, you know, there is such a theory. They respond, oh, how interesting. We've read that maybe it's 10,000 years. Or perhaps the Sphinx has some completely incredible antiquity. All of this, in principle, can be read in Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, The Bottomless Well of the Past. Then I say, tell me, what if I give you a second version, that the pyramids are 600 years old? No, that can't be. In reality, these are 2 absolutely unscientific assertions.
But people want things to be ancient.
Of course, the first version is immediately accepted. It doesn't matter that those dynasties may not have existed. It doesn't matter that we know only 3 dynasties out of 30. But 600 years, that's impossible. By the way, it seems to me that people in general underestimate the depth of time. 600 years is an enormous span, at least 20 generations. And life expectancy back then was lower. We fail to understand how much could have happened in 600 years. Empires could have been created and collapsed. But somehow, we refuse to acknowledge this. We want 5,000 years. Otherwise, we don't agree.
Let's sum up. That was your first question, and now let's ask the second. Please show the poll results. Overall, the audience is divided.
It's a painful question.
Yes, although more people believe that one does not have to be a credentialed historian, still, the audience is split roughly in half. It seems to me that this is also how people are divided in their perception of Fomenko's theory. That, in fact, is why we are doing all this, because a debate emerges. You have a second question.
The next question is, can ancient history be trusted in the complete absence of originals?
As you understand, this is also an extremely important question. We are interested in how much it will engage you and how you will respond. We have a call.
Hello, good evening. I have a question for Garry. I carefully read Fomenko's Empire. The question concerns the following aspect. There is a metropolis, a huge Russo-Turkic state, and there is a province, and for some reason, It is precisely in the metropolis that there are no cultural monuments, no temples, no cities. Meanwhile, all of Europe surrounding the metropolis is full of them. How is that to be understood?
What do you mean by metropolis? What exactly do you have in mind?
Russia, essentially the core of Russia. Moscow.
All right. I'll answer that question right away. At the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century, there was nothing in Europe comparable in scale to the Moscow Kremlin. I'm answering as someone who has visited almost all of these places. Take the Louvre, for example. Everyone knows the French Louvre. I've been there many times. The oldest surviving part is very small and dates to the end of the 16th century, the era of Henry IV. The main building of the Louvre was constructed in the 19th century. Just for the record, London, of course, is an outstanding city, but in 1666 there was the Great Fire, and everything burned down. Practically all the buildings were destroyed. Of course, there is Rome. But I think that even if one applies Fomenko's chronological shift, it is still later, still the beginning of the 17th century. So, if we look at what was located at the center of the metropolis, namely the Golden Ring of Russia and the Kremlin, then it seems to me that everything fits. That's exactly how it should be. At that moment, the largest and greatest buildings were there, and that is where they were supposed to be, at the center of the metropolis.
I keep saying that I am not a historian. I'm trying to understand some logic in what was happening, in what supposedly happened in the ancient world. Recently, I was struck by a question I want to ask you. We've already talked about it. Why didn't the ancient Greeks, who painted wonderfully on vases, invent painting? It's somehow strange. Why did the idea of painting on canvas with paints not occur to them? Paints existed. Canvases existed. Why was that?
In fact, one can ask an endless number of such questions. I tried to choose a more rigid one. For example, how could the fundamental works of the ancient Greeks or ancient Romans have been written without a positional numeral system? That is, without proper 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 9 and 0? You'll be told that Euclid and Archimedes could do it, though I suggest everyone try doing calculations using Roman numerals themselves. Just try it.
Can one even multiply using Roman numerals?
One can. I was told so. I specifically asked mathematicians. It's possible to multiply and divide. By the way, it's very difficult. And I'd like to see how they would represent millions using Roman numerals, because that already requires certain special techniques. But still, it can all be done. But how do you write the Book of Diophantus, which is essentially the foundation of modern algebra, supposedly the 4th century, and the Book of Apollonius of Perga, which deals with conic sections? That is, to an outside observer it is completely obvious that Apollonius and Kepler should have been contemporaries. They should have lived at the same time, because both the complexity and the content of their works clearly indicate authors who are contemporaries. And, incidentally, they did appear at the same time. Everything fits. It's all the late 16th or early 17th century. Only for some reason one of them is assigned to the distant ancient past, and no one bothers to answer the question of how one could solve trigonometric equations without the concept of zero. Let some mathematician answer that question.
And is there a Roman numeral for zero?
No, there is neither the digit zero nor the concept of zero. This is very important. Without zero, trigonometry does not work. What's interesting is this. Let's look at ancient Greek and ancient Roman science, which mysteriously disappeared. According to the official chronology, it all ends somewhere around the 4th century AD. The so-called Arabic numerals appear in the 8th or 9th century. It is perfectly obvious that once a positional numeral system appears, starting with 1 and including 0, the next generation of scholars should arrive at fractions, and then at logarithms. Unfortunately, another 800 years pass. I cannot accept such idiocy on the part of humanity. Humanity takes a step forward. Each generation moves forward. If you allow that all this appeared precisely at the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century, then everything falls into place. It is a consistent path starting from the invention of the positional numeral system. Over the course of 200 years, the entire path is covered. Kepler, Apollonius, Diophantus, all of this appears. Fermat, Newton, Leibniz. There is steady, progressive development. How do we develop? Humanity moves upward. From the crossbow to the atomic bomb there is no gap. Where do these mysterious sinusoids come from? There is no logical answer to that question.
I was always surprised by something else as well. Why didn't the Greeks invent chemistry? They invented physics, but not chemistry. That's strange too.
All right. And what about the question I raised in my introduction? For 600 years the Romans fought wars with virtually no change in their military equipment. War every 10 years. How many generations does it take to forge steel, if all you do is fight, if that's all you're engaged in? Why throughout the entire supposedly brilliant military history did the Romans fight with short swords made of low-grade iron? Steel is not rocket science. One could make the effort, especially if one's life depends on it. Why, for example, didn't the Romans invent the crossbow, despite having gigantic catapults? The crossbow is an excellent weapon. Where are the longbows? All the battles the Romans lost, and there were not many, were precisely those where they were beaten by cavalry with long bows. Inventing a longbow or a crossbow is not that difficult. In general, many things could have been invented. I'm not even talking about gunpowder, but even within the realm of cold weapons, everything could have been improved. How did it happen that for 2,000 years people rode horses, yet according to official history stirrups appear in Europe only in the 8th century, supposedly from China? Surely the Greeks could have invented stirrups.
Hello, Garry Kasparov. One question. How do you relate to the facts of the existence of the ancient Sumerians, Syria, and so on, which our archaeologists, and not only ours, have been talking about for quite a long time now? How does all of this fit into the current concept that you and Mr. Fomenko have laid out?
What do you mean? That people dig something up and there is an inscription on it saying when it was made.
It's clear that we're talking about things like radiocarbon dating or other methods. You have already talked about that. Nevertheless, there are certain methods for estimating temporal parameters based on layers of Earth that accumulate, and so on. Of course, I'm not a professional.
I asked many people who are specifically involved in evaluating such ancient artifacts. Again, I don't know how they would behave in a public debate, although everyone tries to avoid it. But in conversations with specialists, when they realize that they are being asked serious questions, say, when a professional physicist is asking, they all honestly admit that radiocarbon dating is completely useless. The error can be anything, because over such a short time span it cannot be taken seriously. It's fine for dinosaurs. There, an error of 10,000 years doesn't bother anyone. But when you talk about an error of 1,000 or 2,000 years as acceptable, that's simply not serious. I checked. There is another method, thermoluminescence, which is connected with analyzing the time when clay was fired. Nevertheless, even here the error can be on the order of 400 to 500 years.
What about layers?
Soil layers, no. In reality, one needs to understand very clearly what lay underneath. Which layer was at the bottom? What was in it? Today archaeologists use what I would call a lacing method. They find one thing, associated with something they are confident belongs to, say, the 10th century BC, and immediately start building a theory. You have to find something that is absolutely and reliably fixed, for example, unquestionably dated to the 10th century BC. Let them show me such a guaranteed, fixed object. It is very important to understand that fundamental science, radiocarbon dating and all these chemical analyses, came to the aid of archaeology, official history, and official chronology 200 years after the time scale had already been fixed. That is, between the mid-18th century, when all alternative theories were finally crushed, and the appearance of radiocarbon dating and other chemical methods of analysis, 200 years passed. Archaeology never gave physicists the opportunity to analyze parallel theories. I think an experiment could be conducted. You take 10 samples from the same burial and send them to 10 different laboratories without announcing the date. Because physicists always ask, which century does this belong to? Or which era is it from? If such an experiment were conducted honestly, excellent, that's exactly what I'm calling for. Let's do it.
Am I understanding you correctly that if archaeologists dig something up, it is impossible to determine its age?
With today's methods, yes, it's impossible. You can conduct a large number of independent analyses and see whether the results intersect. If you do that, then most likely you could, with a certain degree of confidence, say that we can assign some date. But in reality, they are afraid to conduct such analyses. Because in physical laboratories they know that the spread can be several thousand years, and they always ask, which era does this belong to? In other words, I repeat, today physics is used not to test the data, but to confirm the existing chronology. And those are, generally speaking, two very different things.
I see. Please go ahead.
Hello, I have a question. Fomenko puts forward a hypothesis, essentially denying the existence of scientific historical arguments at all, at least for the period before the 17th century. But by putting forward a hypothesis in order to build a theory, he himself will also be unable to find convincing arguments. What will he build his theory on? Other than arbitrarily taking things like the Crab nebulas and shifting chronology by 1,000 years because of them? Or, for example, a total solar eclipse in the Mediterranean region, linking it to Calvary? This seems arbitrary to me.
The question is clear, thank you.
It seems to me that, once again, we have to proceed from the fact that there is a set of facts. There are already thousands of them. There are inconsistencies and absurdities. One has to look at which theory explains them better. If we compare the data that I have, and I can cite thousands of very different inconsistencies and mismatches, then, in my view, Fomenko's theory explains them better. This does not mean that it is absolutely correct. One has to understand that creating a more or less coherent and constructive version of the past will require generations, because there have been too many distortions and too many manipulations. But it is perfectly obvious that within Fomenko's framework it is much easier to explain all these inconsistencies. Moreover, I do not understand the phrase, scientific historical arguments. What are they based on? Fomenko correctly noted that even the use of generally accepted names, by itself, does not guarantee an accurate answer to a given question. For example, I can give one case, referring to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Suppose that someone today, digging through Old English nautical charts, found a description of a battle between the English and Spanish fleets in the Ethiopian Ocean. Where is the Ethiopian Ocean? Today there is no such name, but one would probably place it somewhere around the Indian Ocean, near the Red Sea. A narrative would then be constructed. After that, some new historical novelist in the vein of Ken Follett would elaborate the story in vivid detail. Later, tourists would be taken to the site. And 50 years later, this would become an established version, and everyone would be told that somewhere off the Somali coast, two squadrons clashed. There is only one problem. In the mid-18th century, English sailors called the South Atlantic the Ethiopian Ocean. This is the mid-18th century, not some 5th century. The error would be 5,000 kilometers. We simply relocate events to a different part of the world. And the most important thing is that a misinterpretation of even one such small fact leads to the creation of a false theory. I argue that the interpretation of literally a small number of facts led to the creation of a theory and to the writing of practically all the books we see in bookstores today. All these books rely on a certain theory that was formed at the end of the 18th century. At the same time, tons of books that did not fit it were automatically excluded. In the 18th century they were simply excluded. In the 17th and late 16th centuries they were burned. By the way, I believe that those fires that were set in Europe, those bonfires in which books disappeared, and those autos de fe had nothing to do with religion at all. They concerned very specific historical events. History itself was simply being burned, and as a result, a particular chronological tree was created, which today is declared infallible.
Do you believe that another tree could grow next to this one? After all, an enormous global historical science stands against Fomenko. These are not just our scholars. These are people who would have to admit that they studied incorrectly and taught incorrectly. Can that happen?
I think it can, because we live in the age of the internet. We live in an era when censorship cannot restrain free thought. There is the possibility to exchange information. One can create a huge website where these issues are discussed and where information flows in. There is a lot of information, it is everywhere. In every church you can find some obvious inconsistency. There are old books. Every person can make a contribution. Of course, it would be better if, instead of fruitless debates, our historians began a serious analysis of what is stored in our archives. That would also be very interesting. Fomenko provides many facts that can be checked through serious linguistic analysis of texts, both of 16th to 18th century Bibles and of royal weapons. Many things can be verified. They put forward many interesting hypotheses that are fairly easy to test, even here today in Russia, in Moscow. I think the process will be a long one. Since Fomenko's theory is based on very serious scientific arguments connected with mathematics, astronomy, and physics, after some time we will obtain fairly clear answers. Unfortunately, they will not come from Russia, because in Russia our scientific community has taken up arms against it. I know that this is not only historians, but also physicists and mathematicians, most of whom demand that Fomenko's pseudoscience be banned. But thank God, there is a free world, there is the internet. I have no doubt that literally within a few years there will appear, I would not even call it an alternative theory, but simply an opportunity to discuss this topic freely and try to find some truth.
So, still within our lifetime?
I am confident that it will take roughly 10 years for the process of dismantling this historical myth, so to speak. I don't know what will emerge in the end. I am not certain that Fomenko's version itself will stand the test of time. But it is absolutely clear that this Egyptian-Assyrian, Macedonian world will not stand the test of time, because its absurdities and duplications are obvious. If you begin to read historical literature seriously, you will discover duplications. They are everywhere. I can give as many examples as you like. Once you start looking closely, and once you know from which angle to look, everything becomes clear.
Please.
Good evening, Garry Kasparov. My question is this: do you think it would be reasonable to abolish the teaching of history in schools altogether? First, because it is already clear that there are masses of mutually contradictory facts that fit together very poorly. And second, and this seems to me the most troubling part, there is an aspect very well described in the book by the French historian Marc Ferro, about how history is taught to children in different countries. It turns out, tentatively speaking, that the same events are explained to children in Armenia and Turkey in completely different ways. Children in the Soviet Union and in Poland were taught completely different versions.
I see.
I think this is a very good question. I would seriously think about it.
Abolish history?
Or at least create some kind of course on understanding history. Because the issue itself is fundamental. Armenia and Turkey, clearly, the same events are told differently. I know that history is now being rewritten in South Africa. The history that was taught in schools for 50 years is now being rewritten.
South Africa aside, it's being rewritten in Russia too.
That's exactly what I'm saying, it's being rewritten.
History is being rewritten in textbooks, right?
Yes, but I think not quite as radically yet. Here, for now, the changes mostly affect the last 70 years. In South Africa, it's the entire 350-year history of the first Dutch and English colonies. In other words, history is rewritten to suit political interests. It is obvious that this clutters children's minds with political noise. Perhaps this simply should not be done. I repeat, history today is burdened with political baggage, and no changes are foreseeable in the near future.
But surely one cannot simply stop studying history altogether.
What do we call history? I proceed from the idea that history is, in general, a somewhat virtual thing. Since childhood, there was a certain history for me, and most importantly, it has remained with me. There are still certain things connected with ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Thank God, I've read all of it. I can recall any date from memory. It is still a kind of world. I have simply become convinced that this world is virtual. And most likely, history will always remain virtual. You can never really cut your way through this wilderness. Even if you deal with an eyewitness, he always writes the way it seems to him. Even if we exclude malicious intent. And imagine that you have several descriptions, each of which is shaped by very specific political necessities.
We have 3 minutes left. I would like to ask a question that seems very important to me. In connection with what you recently said about whether the ancient Romans could or could not have invented certain things. Am I right in understanding that Fomenko's theory is more humanistic? That it says humans are smarter than historians think they are? Am I understanding this correctly or not?
Absolutely. I think Fomenko's theory is a hymn to humanity. Humanity has been developing. How did it happen that humans invented the alphabet 11 to 12 centuries ago? How did they invent a proper system of calculation? That is another matter. Perhaps there really was some kind of divine inspiration. But from the moment the alphabet appeared, from the moment people learned how to preserve knowledge, there has been continuous human development. There has been no degradation, neither physical, nor intellectual, nor cultural. These are myths. What are these supposed gaps in history? Humanity develops. One can even say quite precisely where human development began. Incidentally, if we look at a world map today, we will see that the regions which laid the foundations of human development are the same regions that are still ahead today. Everyone else follows them. That is, the gap between the leading part of humanity and those who follow it persists.
Let's wrap up the poll results. The majority still believe that without any surviving originals, ancient history can't be trusted. Yet 28 people think it can. I'm curious. On what basis?
This is basic human psychology. Saying no effectively amounts to claiming that history itself never existed, since as everyone now realizes, no original ancient texts have survived. Let me repeat, everything we read today is, at best, copies of books published at the end of the 15th century or the beginning of the 16th, and in most cases much later.
I'll now slowly guide our conversation toward its end. I should say that we will continue to talk about the new chronology. In the near future, we would like to invite the historian Yuri Afanasyev. I do not know whether he will agree. We also want to invite several other scholars to our show in order to hear a different point of view. I hope you will come to see us as well. When will you be in Moscow?
At the end of August.
I hope that at the end of August you will come, and we will talk in even greater detail. Once again, I would like to show you this book with a foreword by Garry Kasparov. It is a new book by Fomenko and Nasovsky. We are often asked where one can buy the books. For now, you cannot, it is only just coming out. It is titled, Introduction to the New Chronology. Which day in August will you arrive?
On the 25th.
So that you do not forget us before August 25th, here is our traditional gift, a notebook with the inscription Vremechko. Make a note somewhere for August 26th to come and see us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I, your host Andrei Maksimov, say goodbye.